Okay. Hello. Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Um, so today, as advertised, because I don't falsely advertise, we're going to be, I'm moving chat out of the way here. We're going to be talking about norms and trust, which are things that certainly many of us, and I for sure, have been thinking about for several years now. Trust, I talk about in my most recent book. Norms, we've all been talking about. So that's what I want to talk about today, in the past, and then what that suggests about the present. However, before I do that, I must turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
And good morning, everybody. Welcome. Rules of the game. We encourage you to please use chat for lots of comments and questions and lots of things to say. We ask that, of course, that you keep it family friendly and as close and germane to the conversation as possible. If you do have questions, please put them in Q&A. That is a lot easier to track where, that we get to everybody's questions. So put any questions that you have for Joanne or myself, most likely Joanne, in your in Q&A, and we will make sure to take care of that in about a half hour or so. And as always, if you like what we're doing here at the National Council of History Education, please join us. You can join us at www.ncheteach.org, and you can look around our site, see all the good things that we have. We're also on social media at History Ed and that is now for Facebook and for Twitter. Just as a shout out to everybody, if you could hold August 3rd and 4th, those are our save the dates for our second annual Equity Summit. Looking forward to some great content. We've got lining up our keynotes as we speak, and our sessions, and it's coming along great. And the planning is, so we should have the full lineup out in the next few weeks. But we're really excited to get the folks that we have. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Joanne, and let's have a great conversation today.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Okay. So norms and trust. These are things, both of these things are essential to our political system. And what interests me about them is that they're unwritten and pretty amorphous and thus vulnerable. And that, I mean, as a political historian, I'm interested generally in how politics works, but what I'm really interested in is all of the underpinnings and bases and foundations and assumptions that keep the system running, because they're not written and they're not generally recorded, and yet they're so important. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And as I suggested at the outset, people have been talking about norms for about roughly the last 4 years. And you know, when I sat down this morning to think about what I wanted to say to you and to rummage around online to see what I could find, excuse me, I went on, just try going on Google sometime and punching in norms violated. You'll get a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of conversation about norms, but not very much conversation about how that has anything to do with the founding period or the founders or what they assumed about our political system or how our political system works generally. And I will say, and I wouldn't say this if it weren't for the fact that I spoke with a number of other historians over the course of the last 4 years, particularly constitutional historians who agreed with me. So I'm not speaking out of ignorance. And I've said this, I know, on here before, that when I teach my history classes, I usually teach the Constitution by saying it's a remarkably skeletal outline of a government if you think about it. It's very short for what it does. There's most detail is missing. And I talk about how the assumption there was that partly things would be filled in as the government went into motion, and that everything couldn't be recorded in the way that, I don't know if anyone assumes it should be, but it certainly isn't in our Constitution. And I've been at Yale for over 20 years, and for over 20 years, I've given some version of that speech. What's underlying that speech, of course, is that all of the unwritten things are functioning. They just don't happen to be in the Constitution, and we're either sort of working our way, improvising as we go, or shifting things as we go, or evolving in one way or another. But what I hadn't focused on before the last few years was the degree to which norms truly hold up our system. If you had asked me that intellectually, I would have acknowledged that. But in speaking with other historians, they had the same feeling that I did, which is a sort of gut punch realization, like, wow, like norms are really vulnerable. And there's not a lot you can do when a norm is violated, and it's not really illegal, and yet it's somehow not right. And so that's essentially what I wanted to talk about today. When we talk about norms, what we're talking about, this is according to a scholar, so I am quoting a scholar, Josh Chavitz is his name. Norms are unwritten rules and conventions for democratic governance that are not specified in law, but as a matter of shared awareness. So unwritten, essential for democratic governance, not specified in law, but a matter of shared awareness. That's the sort of stuff I'm always very interested in. And what do I mean by that? Well, what's an example of a norm? A really easy one, right? Presidents releasing their tax returns. That hasn't been done eternally, but it's been done for most of the last few decades worth of presidents. I don't think it's something we thought about before until someone decided not to do it. And then suddenly you realize, oh, like that's a norm, and in some way I want to know something about this person's financial background, and now I can't, and that's a certain level of transparency that's gone away. So that's a great example of a norm that's not written down anywhere, but it gets violated, and then it's been violated. And that shows you the vulnerability. And never, it remains something that wasn't done, and it remains to be seen with a lot of violated norms, what will happen as we move ahead. A really minor violated norm that I noticed at the very beginning of the Trump presidency, which is going to lead to my next point here. It doesn't seem like it should matter at all, but I think in an underlying kind of way it does. I remember really early on, former President Trump got onto a plane, one of his first trips somewhere, walked up the stairs of the plane, and he didn't turn around to wave at the cameras and the people watching. And I noticed it, right? I was like, well, that presidents usually wave to us, right? Before they go on a trip. It's a public appearance. They wave to acknowledge that they are recognizing us. They're in our service, on our business as they go off on a trip. I noticed it and I thought it was weird. And I remember tweeting about it. And I think it was a reporter responded and said, I never thought about that, but you're totally right. It's totally expected and it didn't happen. And that's a little weird. Now that's very seemingly minor. And it changed over time, and former President Trump adopted that convention. But what that sort of thing does, the reason why that sort of thing is important is because it's a display of a demonstration of shared values that we have as a nation, as a people, in that case, shared democratic values, that the people who matter in government are us, right? That public servant means something, and that wave is an acknowledgement that the person is either serving us or acknowledging us or in our service or in our duty, one way or another. It's a sort of democratic bow of sorts. And that sort of thing matters, particularly in a democracy where there is a lot of freedom and there is a lot of play, and there should be, because government by the people, there needs to be ways for the people to express their opinion and for government to adapt accordingly. Now, that same scholar that I mentioned before, Josh Chavitz, I hope I'm saying his name right, he makes a really interesting point, which is why I'm quoting him here. He said, the interesting thing about norms is there are some things you don't want to solidify. There are some things that you really don't want to write down because you want a little bit of play in the system. You want there to be the ability sometimes for speed or agility or adaptability, and norms allow for that to happen. Of course, that is, as I've already mentioned, a potential vulnerability that can lead to trouble. As I was writing my notes this morning, it made me think of Hamilton, because of course everything makes me think of Hamilton, but no, in this case, truly, Hamilton was once at a dinner party with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And I believe John Adams said, without the corruption, the British government would be the finest government on the face of the earth. And Alexander Hamilton said, with the corruption, the English government is the finest government on the face of the earth, because you need that corruption to keep the system running. And by corruption, he meant people making deals or offering other people favors, or the sorts of things we don't like to see, but that to Hamilton were just practical politics. So that's a particularly blunt Hamiltonian way of referring to a little bit of what I'm talking about here. There is scholarship on this, so I don't mean to say here that no one has ever realized the importance of norms. Of course, political scientists and social scientists and political historians have written about this, have thought about this, but our political system takes them somewhat for granted, which is why I think many of us haven't thought about it in a concrete way until we saw things being violated and realized they could be violated and there was not much we could seemingly do about it. And some of them other, sort of similar norms that we take for granted, besides not releasing your tax returns, personally profiting from official business, for example, not having a conflict of interest in office, or norms of civility, right? Like, and again, I point to the former President Trump, by saying lock her up. Right. Normally, presidents don't say that they're going to lock up their opponents. So there's a variety of different things that, on one hand, can be sort of passed off as like rhetoric, or you're exaggerating. It's just what happens in campaigning. However, there are also expressions in one way or another of values and assumptions about what the person uttering those things is going to abide by. So it matters that someone says that, right? It matters because it says something about the person uttering that. And it matters because once that's out in the world, it can have an impact, right? So, and I've said this a lot of times before on here, that words matter. They matter far more than we can imagine. And that's part of what a lot of people were saying in the late 1850s when they were worried about North versus South polarization maybe tearing the nation apart. One of the things they kept saying over and over and over again in Congress was, watch your words. Words matter. Watch your words, because the wrong words could lead to violence on the floor of Congress, mass violence on the floor of Congress, and maybe civil warfare. So, it sounds sort of trivial, but it's not trivial at all that words matter. Now, certainly the last administration is not the first time that there were violated norms. It might have a record for the number of norms violated and the glee with which they were violated. I don't know. But, Richard Nixon, President Nixon, he had a good number of violated norms. You can march through time and see now and again, people who, for one reason or another, some of them logical and not self-serving, others just self-serving. So I'm not saying that this is something brand new, but it's something important. It's something to think about. And I think it's something that until the last few years, we totally took for granted, which is what you're supposed to do with norms. Now, this, in a sense, this whole idea also, of course, brought me back to the founding era. And it made me think about that skeletal constitution that I mentioned, where much remained to be worked out. In, I guess, the mid and late 1790s, when the founding folk were looking at what was happening in France, and some people were saying, well, we should take what we did here and we should offer it to them there because it's such a great constitution, right? It'll serve them really well there. And I think actually, I didn't even look this up. I think it might be Gouverneur Morris who said, someone said, but I think it's Gouverneur Morris, said that a government needs to fit a country like a jacket fits a man, right? That you can't take a government from one country and give it to another. It needs to be custom made. It needs to be suited to the individual. And that holds true for everything, including norms. So there was a lot of assumption, I think, on the part of the founders that the system itself in the Constitution, that was enough to hold up a government. If you think about it, the government was so young, it's not as though they'd had time to build up a lot of norms. They hadn't, although they recognized that there were norms and that they could be violated. And a great example of that is Hamilton in the election of 1800, when he realizes that the contest might go to Jefferson and Burr, and he writes to Governor John Jay of New York and says, we need to change the way that New York chooses presidential electors, because if we don't, an atheist, and he has a whole string of horrible things he says about Jefferson, is going to get the seat of power. And then he goes on to really show the ways in which he realizes he's violating a norm. He says, I know this isn't quite right. I know this is not something we should normally do, but it's not illegal. Right? He literally is saying right there, it's not illegal. And there are certain emergencies, certain circumstances when you really have to go to extremes. And this is one of them. It's about the country. So we need to, he doesn't say it this way, but basically we need to violate this norm, not break a law, but violate this norm. And John Jay, to his credit, on the bottom of the letter writes, suggested for party purposes, which do not suit, this should not be put into action. It's a party gesture and I'm not going to do it. But there you see, a sort of, at least even in the first 10 years of the government, a norm about you don't mess with the electoral system during an election, which seems like a basic one, but hey, who knew that it wasn't as basic as we thought? This brings me to trust, which I find really interesting. I hadn't thought about it before as a tool of governance until I was working on my last book. And what made me think about it was the degree to which the functioning of Congress relied on a certain level of trust that the system of Congress, the rules of Congress, the working of Congress was fair, that everyone had an equal chance to get what they wanted done. That in a sense was part of what held the country together in the minds, I think, of people operating in that framework. Was the union was a union of equal parts, and Congress was supposed to be the place where all of those parts come together and have an equal chance of getting what they want. Now, of course, the book is about all of the ways in which Southerners deployed threats and violence to tip the scale, but the general idea that our electoral system is based on trust, and not just trust in each other, which I actually is not so much what I'm talking about, but trust, our ability to trust the system. And the most extreme example of this, and the way in which this, is sort of in our faces, and it's, in the last year or two, we're having this exposed. We really need to be able to trust the electoral process. Right? That's the ultimate example of trust, if you think about it. It's assumed we have a process and states have, laws and regulations, and we essentially know how it works, although hanging chads surprised us, but still. In a general way, there have been hiccups and worse over the years, but generally speaking, I think Americans have trusted in the idea that our electoral system basically functions, that an election happens, something is concluded, someone wins, and generally speaking, the person who appears to have won actually won. And part of what we've seen in recent years was a very deliberate effort to undermine confidence in our electoral process, which was not that hard to do, which is a blatant example, a really interesting example of the degree to which trust holds our political process together. I mean, just think about your assumptions. Put yourself 10 years back and think about what you assumed about elections, right? Of course, there are some corrupt elections and things go wrong. And I'm not meaning to say we all had little halos above our heads. We were like, elections are always good. But generally speaking, you believe that in a general election, if it was clear that, and even if it's clear that someone won by electoral votes and not by the popular vote, I'm not even talking about that. But if it was clear under our current system that someone won, what you didn't expect was people stepping forward and saying, no, the system was rigged. It might be invisible how it was rigged. And yet it is rigged, and we're going to find a way to prove it. Even if you don't believe that charge, some people will. And then what you've successfully done, if you say that often enough and loudly enough and find little, bits of straw to base that on, is you undermine people's trust in the political system. Trust in the national government. That's something that certainly has suffered over the years, but still, on a certain level, that's important. There are ways in which trust, such an invisible thing, such a seemingly flimsy thing, such a seemingly non-political thing, really underlies a process of democratic governance where you're supposed to assume, generally speaking, the government is made to serve the people, that the people, if they have a strong desire or a strong will be able to express that will and have it be heard. That members of Congress, in one way or another, are supposed to represent your interests, not that they always do, but generally speaking, it's nice to believe that you're a member of Congress, assuming that you agree with their politics. And again, that's our system at work. So maybe you don't agree with their politics, but still, expecting yourself and your region to be represented through your representative or senator in Congress, that's kind of basic as well. And again, I don't mean to say that what we've been seeing in recent years, that all of it is brand new, because it isn't. And as a historian, I always tell my students, anytime you stand up or in a paper say definitively, this is the first time, or this is the only time, 99% of the time you're going to be wrong. And a historian is going to step up and tell you that. Like, nope, sorry, in 1792. So saying that sort of thing, even if you're just thinking in a shallow way as a historian, it's always dangerous to say first or only. That said, there have been all kinds of examples over the centuries of things being violated and trusts being violated and people rethinking the system. But we're seeing now a degree of lack of trust in the basic process of election that is disturbing, right? Because what that means is a basic level of distrust just in the simple process of democracy. Now, from more than a year ago, when I first started doing this, in a sense, that's what drove me here. Partly it was pandemic isolation, and partly it was my fears about democracy, about the fate of democracy, about the fact that people didn't realize the degree to which democracy was under attack. And at various points, I've become more or less able to sleep, depending on how anxious I am at a given moment. But at this moment, I just think the simple fact that there's a group of a substantial number of people in our population who do not trust the electoral process and basically will not trust it again, that's like a fault line in democracy. That lack of trust, when you don't have that trust, you're leaving space for force. You're almost asking for someone to come in with force and impose what you want. I don't need to say it, but I will say it. That's not good. So I raise norms and trust because I think in both cases, they're easy to dismiss, seemingly unimportant, and the kinds of things that make democracy run. So as I do every week, I mention these things partly and talk about them in the past, partly so that they can sort of be in front of us today as we're evaluating politics. This falls into that category, particularly thinking about the degree to which trust is being eroded, thinking about what that means, not simply accepting the fact that something is untrustworthy, but thinking about the fact, as I've said before, about propaganda, that people might want you to lose trust, that they might want you to lose trust in the democratic process, and that might be very explicitly for partisan gain. I think I'll stop with that dire statement. what I didn't do this week. Normally I have this little clock which you can't see, and I sit it up here and I stare at it, and then I magically know what time it is, and I forgot my clock. So now I'm looking off to the side to see what time it is. But I will stop. I think I will stop talking there. I will say the last thing that I actually skipped and that I will add in. I did look a little bit up online at Nixon to see what happened the last time there was someone who really substantially, consistently violated norms. And in part, the guardrails were bolstered a little bit around the norms, not new laws, but like there were regulations passed to make it harder for the White House to infiltrate the FBI and the Justice Department. There were internal watchdogs of various sorts put into play. All of these things have been smacked against or ignored in the last administration, but still, there were attempts to undergird, to bolster up some of the things that appeared to be easy to erode. I don't have an answer to what should happen now, but we all really need to think hard about what norms are being violated, whoever is doing the violating, what that suggests about their politics and about what they want, and what kind of impact that has on the American public, and thus what kind of impact that's going to have on the spirit and working of our nation as a whole. Okay, now I will officially stop and open things up to questions. Oh, Carolee, mug. Maybe in year 92, maybe like 100 years from now, I'll be like, the mug. Okay, so the mug. I had a hard time today, like norms and trust. I really dug around a little. And as I've said before, it's not like I have an infinite supply of mugs. However, this mug was given to me by some wonderful History Matters person, and I don't know who. So
we have
thank
a list. We just haven't shared it.
I was gonna say,
there is a list.
There is a list, and if this is not on the list, it should be, because someone sent it to me, and I was not good about recording who. What it says on it is, funny, I don't recall asking for your opinion, which is as close as I could come to norms. It's like, I'm going to do what I want and your opinion doesn't matter, which is kind of norm-like, right? So that's about as close as I could get. Opinion, norm, that's okay. Thank you. Some of you are agreeing with me. That was as close as I could get there, and I appreciate. And it is a great mug, isn't it? It's
a great mug.
It is a great mug. Thank you, whoever it is who sent it to me. If you're out there and listening, pipe up, because I would like to know who you are, because I think I never officially thanked you. Every once in a while, I get a box, and in this case, I got a box, and it had 2 mugs in it, and it probably had a card or a name, but I didn't know, and I was like, cool. I don't know who it came from. Thank you, random person. Okay, now I will stop talking. So we can look at the background. For those of you who might be new, we do this every week, in which I have a mug that relates to the theme of the episode, and Matt chooses a background that has something to do with the episode.
Yes, we need a little levity this week, and I was inspired by Joanne's tweet. So this is, of course, the set for Cheers, and in which, of course, you call
Norm!
out. Exactly.
Just scared the heck out of newbie.
Needed just a little bit of levity this week. It's been that kind of week, so I thought this would be a little bit fun, a little bit easier. So that's what I went with.
I put Norm in the tweet in which I announced this, because how could you not say Norm? So I did, and I assumed that most people would get it, and indeed they did. Yeah, I just yelled Norm, and newbie just jumped.
Oh, love it. Okay, well, we got lots of great questions. Everybody is killing it this week.
Yes.
Hang on. Melissa asked 2 questions. I got to read them both.
Okay. Oh, and Donna does not have the contributor information for that mug. So someone out there.
Oh, no. Okay.
Whoever sent me the mug, step forward to get credit. Okay, now go ahead.
All right. So Melissa has asked 2 questions. I'm going to pick one that I think is a good starting point, which is, are there any bad, and in parentheses, not supportive of democracy or perhaps discriminatory norms? How could that be decided? So
I'll mention two.
yeah.
Actually, I mentioned one. White male presidents.
Mm.
Big
Yeah.
norm. that's that's a big norm. There's nothing holding that in place except us, right?
Mhm.
Except votes. And that is detrimental, you know. And there have been a lot of good people who served in that office, but there's absolutely no reason why there only can be white male presidents.
Mhm.
So that's a norm that not only do people don't necessarily think of that as a norm. Actually, what they assume is it's normal to have a white male president, that that's how it's supposed to work. That's a choice. That's a choice we make, and that's a great thing about thinking about norms. Is
And
that
maybe right along those lines, we could add um, mansplaining our female representatives and senators. I'm thinking particularly of the she persisted with Elizabeth
right?
Warren, right? Like this sort of in the state of Michigan here, we've had this occurs on a regular basis. The legislature seems to want to mansplain our female representatives and governor and other elected leaders, and so that maybe is another one that we could dig into. And I know we've dug into gender before in this show.
Well,
So
right, and some of these are gender norms that
mhm.
are obviously have a place in politics because politics isn't above those things. Politics is those things in many ways. But yeah, that's a really obvious example of a norm. Yeah, there certainly can be other. I'm sure there are
Mhm.
a lot of other norms that are not necessarily positive or making things better. Um, but you actually have to in the way that we just did in an easy way, you have to stand up and say, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be that way. And for a long period of time, no one would have done that regarding white male presidents, right? It's semi recently that people would say, semi recently, that there could be someone besides a white man as a president. So one of the things about violated norms is that you have to actually point out it's only a norm, which means that it's a choice. And in the case of it being a bad norm, like just trimming, cutting people out or trimming people off or in some way being exclusionary, that's not necessarily a good thing. And at least you should question why it's in place and what it does and what it would mean to change it.
So I actually have an interesting one. I was just saw through the comments, and this actually occurred to me. Um, what about the and I know there are rules that like AP uses about this, but when we refer to presidents in newspaper or in other that we only use their last name and it's or in some instances, but their title in other instances. And is there a history of that? But do you know?
It's a good question. Well, I think there are multiple histories. So I think on the one hand, there's probably conventions and norms about how the public refers to
Mhm,
like a president or a member of Congress. But I also think there are press conventions that
mhm,
are not necessarily always identical to the public. And I mention that only because not on a political level, but on a personal level, if when I write an op-ed or something for a newspaper, I sometimes I will see what it looks like before it goes out, and I will step forward and say, I don't want to be called Miss Joanne Freeman, or I want to be called Doctor, or I want this affiliation to be put up next to my name. And very often the response is, we do not do that for
mm,
anybody, which I will accept. But some part of me is like, I don't really like that norm. And sometimes it's complicated by woman versus man issues
mhm.
because men sort of dominated, and so a norm actually didn't matter. But now that a woman's in the place, it actually does matter in a way that hadn't been anticipated, and the norm hasn't been changed. But yeah, it's. I know we've talked about this before. That one of the first debates in the first Congress is what to call the president, right?
Mhm.
there's never been a president before. So what does that mean? And what do you call him? His Excellency, Your Excellency, His Elective Highness, as I think that's the one John Adams prefers.
That's my favorite.
That is my favorite. Mr. President ends up being, the solution, which John Adams detests. But that's an admission that that sort of thing really matters, right? It matters because it will help define the office. And as I said a little while back, it defines and displays the value of the politics of that person or of that role. And so it matters.
So getting back to, questions from our audience, which sorry to take a little detour there, but I was kind of curious about that line of questions. Dale wants to know, what are some key instances of a lack of trust in the government during the founding period?
Well, the most obvious one that jumps to mind, again, is the election of 1800. People worried in the election of 1796 that France was infiltrating the election and they wanted Jefferson to be president. And so there was concern about that. But it's in 1800, the contest of 1800, that you have people in, I believe, Maryland and Virginia, with governors aware of the fact that people were gathering arms in case they needed to go to Washington and take the government for the person who they felt rightfully had it, which was Jefferson, and not allow the Federalists to do something funky with it, which that's what people were afraid of, is the Federalists would decide it wasn't an election, or the Federalists would have a president pro tem, or whatever it was that they were going to do, it wasn't going to be allowable. And so if you're arming to march and take the government because you think people are going to violate norms, that's a pretty severe assumption about violated norms. And that's along the lines of what I said before about elections. Suddenly you have people who are not relying on the fact that people in office of one particular party are going to abide by the system.
So Tim asks, I think it's germane to what we're talking about here. Although free speech is protected in the First Amendment, what kind of speech is still normalized as taboo to speak about in early American history?
So what kind of speech was taboo in early American?
Was normalized as taboo in early American history? So what beyond things like the words that we've talked about in the past, like scoundrel and
liar,
liar, yeah. But are there other kinds of speech that were normalized as taboo in early American history?
Well, I mean, this one's going to sound very foreign, and it's in line with those sort of dueling words: scoundrel, rascal, puppy, liar, coward. Puppy is ultimately my favorite. The assumption was, that you weren't supposed to personally insult people in politics, right? You were supposed to aim for their professional character, their political character. If you personally insulted them, you could resort to the code of honor and a duel. Mm-hmm. But the assumption was that was not supposed to be the sort of thing that was ongoing, like in Congress or in a legislature. Of course, I just wrote a book about, several decades in which people did that very thing. But here's the thing: the power of that kind of behavior is that it wasn't allowable, and the people who were doing it anyway and not getting called on it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing: is if you are gleefully violating norms, aware and assuming that you not only do you have the power to do that, but people who follow you are going to like that about you. That's an interesting situation, and that gives you a degree of power. It gave these Southern slaveholders power. They could do what they wanted. They knew they basically wouldn't get called on it, and they could silence and intimidate anyone who stood up to try and fight against slavery. So yeah, it's fuzzy. When you talk about norms of trust, it's fuzzy, but that doesn't mean it's not powerful.
Susan would like to know, when is codifying norms in law dangerous? Tax returns seem important, can suits not so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question. Like, let's think about that for a moment. Why would you not put in writing something that says people running for president must show their tax returns? I don't know. I mean, can anyone think of how that might be manipulated? Or seems like an easy one, right? But I hesitate to say that because as someone who studied the process of writing the Constitution, nothing's ever that easy. Nothing's ever simple. And you're like, well, that would be easy. And then the world blows up.
Well, I mean, so I'm playing devil's advocate here, which, so just to kind of continue the line of thinking, presumably somebody could have a tax return where, you know, there's so many, they've utilized every loophole in the tax structure to, so it looks like they're clean, but maybe they're dirty. I don't know. Is that what, or even thinking about Hamilton, right? With the, I'm blanking on the affair.
Reynolds?
The Reynolds affair, right? Like with the payments he was making to Reynolds, right? Like if he had not published that, and which is a whole other story, would it have had a different effect if he had
just a case in which he was saying, I'm not violating political norms.
Yeah.
I'm violating social norms. I'm an adulterer, but I'm not corrupt, right?
Right.
So I'm not violating the norms and spirit of governance. I'm just violating my marriage, you know, and in his mind, if you're a toss up between the two, he thinks that the more important one for his role in public life is what the public think of him as a leader. And yeah, that's quite a choice, an interesting choice. But yeah, he is deciding which norms he's going to violate and which he thinks are more serious than others.
Well, and you know, we're focused heavily on the president here, but we also have 435 representatives and 100 senators who, you know, are also our leaders. And you know, to what extent should we expect them to live up to the same norms that would ask for a president, whether it's tax returns or following ethics rules or disclosing their stock holdings? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, in a more general way, it would be a good thing, kind of along the lines of post-Nixon. It would be a fine thing if people sat down and had an open, honest, serious conversation about, kind of along the lines of the question that was just asked. What might one be able to put in writing in a soft enough way that it's not going to do damage, but in a hard enough way that it's going to put a little bit of a guardrail up? Now, that sounds like a fine thing, but to do that thing, you need to get people in a room of different politics who are willing to have that kind of conversation. We are not at a conversational moment in the realm of politics right now. And, you know, there you see, you know, a democratic politics is based on debate and compromise. We don't have those things really right now. And thus, you know, in a certain sense, the process of politics isn't really functional in the way that it should be. If it were, then that would be a fine thing to talk about. And that could be a really, not only an important debate for power holders making choices, but an important debate for the public to see and be part of, right? What do we want to prop up as being part of the spirit of our government? That connects to something I've talked about many times before, which is, do we or don't we have a we that we imagine? Is there an American we feel that we're part of? And right now it's a pretty fractured we. But in ideal circumstances, this would be a great moment to talk about what we stand for and what we want to stand for, and what happened that we really don't want to see happen again, not in a partisan way, but just in a procedural way. We just can't really have, it seems we can't really have conversations that are above party right now.
I think there's lots there. Let's get back to some of our questions. There are lots of great questions this week. So Kathleen asks, and I'm going to ask the question and then I will try to reframe it a little bit so we can extend the conversation. So Kathleen is asking, why were so many people okay with the former president violating so many norms? Should we take a closer look at what happened in the past that brought us to this moment in time? And so, I think it's a fair question. Is and you had mentioned this a little bit earlier about how these Southerners pre-Civil War, they knew that could get away with it, that they were never getting called on it. So,
Well,
and I
not only
wonder,
that, but they were elected for it.
right?
That's the thing, is that like Henry Wise of Virginia, who always said the things that no one is supposed to say, and I sang hallelujah because then I could quote it in my book. He's the guy who says, you want to send me home? You want to like throw me out of Congress for having this sort of behavior? Go right ahead, because I will be reelected and brought right back, because that's why I'm here. I'm here to fight for the interests of the people back home. And when he meant fight, he meant fight.
Mhm.
So it's not even that people are being called on it, it's that they're being applauded for it. And that becomes, because that happens, it becomes a part of acceptable, normal politics for some, but not for all. So, I do think there are different reasons why bad behavior might be normalized. In one way or another, probably it has to do with power. But still, there were a lot of people, what they liked, and this is not just true of Trump, but, the sort of fascination we always have with people who are not politicians and have no political experience, and they're going to come in and they're going to erase the corruption and no more deep state, and they're going to step right forward and use force to make things right. We have a long tradition of acting as though that kind of person is the person we want to put in office. And part of the appeal of that is some of the stuff that we're talking about here, which is a person who's not a career politician, but who's going to step forward and say, that's nonsense, we should do this. And some people are really going to like that kind of behavior. And some leaders are going to love being able to do that sort of thing and violate norms because it's a display of power. So on a personal level, on a leaderly level, there's just, I think, can be sheer pleasure in the power that displays, that you're doing that and getting away with it. I'm sure that was all true of my Southern congressman as well. And then also, it's totally possible that you're being supported and put into office by people who want you to do precisely that. That's not necessarily. Yesterday, I was working on my podcast with Heather Cox Richardson, and I said something, I can't remember what it was, but I have a way of being very diplomatic in the way I say things, like people tossing aside democratic norms. That's not ideal. It's like really not ideal. I'm not being very diplomatic here, but yeah. So I'll get right back to where I started. Right, that sort of the norms we accept or drop. That's a demonstration of the values that we accept and want. And we are not all in the same value zone right now as Americans. And that boils down even to the level of democratic practices. And that's the moment that we're in. And so, it's worth looking at norms that people are pursuing and on all sides, and seeing what that suggests about the values or priorities of whoever is making a choice that very obviously is either violating a norm or ignoring a norm. That's a choice, and it's a choice that it's worth considering.
So just to extend that idea, then we're seeing an emergence of folks in positions of elected power, locally, statewide, federally, that have what might be described as fringe beliefs, folks that maybe believe things that, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, that are well outside of the norm of what most individuals would be able to believe. Have we seen that at other times in history? First of all, is that true? And then, have we seen that in other times of history? And how have we dealt with it in the historical past?
So the short answer is this is not the first time that people either in power or people who put people in power have come up with ideas or thoughts or wannabe norms that feel not just fringe, but like way out there.
Right.
On a on a planet that, we do not feel that we necessarily live on. Again, I've talked about this a lot of times before, right? This is, if you asked Hamilton about the weaknesses of a democratic government, one of the things he would say is it's grounded on public opinion. And public opinion can be silly, can be stupid, can be unstable, can be misinformed, can be manipulated by demagogues. That's a really dangerous foundation for a government, which is why Hamilton so badly wanted strong structures of government and empowered national government, was because he didn't trust. He acknowledged, okay, the Constitution we've put in effect has this as its base, and there's not much I can do about that, but I can compensate for it with government structures. So, I'm not speaking against democracy, but it is worth acknowledging that historically speaking, democracies are vulnerable. That's why, or democratic governments generally, whatever kind of government, are vulnerable. And that's precisely why the founders were agonizing so much over structures and processes and practices. They looked at the long view of history and they saw, how all kinds of democratic governments are toppled by ambitious men, by greedy people, by one or another of the things that can warp us, right? The public opinion.
Well, just a couple more questions. Jeannie wanted to know, are traditions also norms? What about the notion that that's the way that we've always done it, which is often used to oppose change?
This is going to sound like a sort of amorphous answer. I think traditions can be norms, but they don't have to be. And I guess by that I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm going to stick by that because I think that's true. There are some things that are just traditions. We've always done it this way. And there are some things that are, this is the way it should be. And those are not necessarily the same thing. That's, I think, what I'm trying to say. Now that sometimes those are the same and sometimes they're not. I remember really early on in my time at Yale, and there was something in the process that seemed to me inherently just illogical. And I remember saying, as a brand new faculty member and just finished my dissertation, and I said to some senior person, like, why do we do this way? Because it makes no sense. And I can think of 5 other ways we could do it that don't disadvantage anybody, that would be so much better. And the response was, well, we've always done it that way. It was like a non-response, right? And so that person was kind of saying, well, that's the tradition, and I'm not going to think about it beyond that. That's just the way it always happened. That's kind of using norm as an excuse, but I don't think they're necessarily identical. Yeah, Carolee says the many voices of Joanne. I know, I make funny voices. I can't help it.
I love your voices. It's like listening.
I don't, and to be totally honest, I generally don't assume people can hear. And then a comment like that, and it's like, oh gosh, people really can hear me doing the funny voices.
Well, it's like listening to an audiobook, like, because you're almost narrating other people. It's wonderful. I love it.
When I did recently, I did Preet Bharara's podcast, and I don't remember what I said, but I said something, and he said, and whenever you say that, you have to say it in that voice. And I remember thinking, oh no, it's one of my voices, and I didn't mean to. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's good. Okay, two more final questions from our 2 Donnas. Donna Flanagan's up first. If a deviation from a norm has no consequences, can that deviation become a new norm?
If people allow it to, it can. Sure. If something happens and it's different and no one says anything about it, and thus people do it again, sure. It could become a norm, which is a great reason why, it's right back to what I just said. It's important to speak up. If something is happening that seems either abnormal or not proper or worth mentioning, if no one stands up, then it can become a norm. And there are a lot of things that we would not want to become norms. So yeah, that's, again, if someone had the oomph to go back and look at all the past episodes, the number of times I've said public opinion, right? The public matters, it's grounded on the public. I will continue to say that. over and over and over again. But that's because it's true, and it's because I think people don't think about that. And I think at a time like the present, it's easy to assume that things are in motion and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's wrong.
Okay, so one last question from Donna Nestler, which is, if trust is lost, can it ever truly be regained?
Oh,
Sort of ending with the heady questions
I
today.
know, boy. Okay, so my gut response to that, if trust is lost, can it be returned or recreated?
Regained, yeah.
I think the answer to that is yes, but I think the only way to do that is to have someone, a leader who explicitly sets out to do that, who is very transparent in what they're doing, who it takes a special kind of person, I think, to step forward and say, norms have been violated. I'm not talking about partisanship. I'm talking about our system. And as I've said multiple times, even just today, we're not at a moment where that's easy to do. So the short answer is yes, I think it's possible. The longer answer is yeah, but boy, that's really hard to do. And so I don't think it's impossible, but it's part of why I'm talking about trust today, because I think chipping away at trust in national institutions, trust in government, trust in the democratic processes, that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to build back up. It can be done, but it's hard to do. And this is a horrible, dire thing to end on. That's how governments slide into being something that they didn't start out being. Sorry about that, guys.
No, that's okay.
That's kind of where the conversation and the question led. So,
well, I appreciate that, and I think it's a good way to end. Despite its sort of direness, I think it's a good way to end for the day, because really what we're talking about ultimately is this idea of establishing norms that support the kind of people we want to be, and calling out the norms that make us into the people we don't want to be. Right? I mean, is that a fair way of summarizing our day, dear?
Yeah, but that, a people, we have to have a vague agreement at least on what we want and who we want to be. And there's some pretty fundamental parts of that question right now which we're not in agreement on, and we're at that moment.
Yeah.
But that gets back to, here's a slightly more positive twist on what I just said. That gets back to the idea that what we do and what we think and how we act really matters. And it matters particularly at a moment like the present moment, when I'm going to say the word, highly contingent moments, contingency, because things can be changed for the better in addition to being changed for the worse. It's a moment of opportunity. It's like, it reminds me of what Hamilton did say in a letter to Washington before the Constitutional Convention. And he says something along the lines of, like, this is a moment. We can take this moment and do something important and good with it. If we let this moment slip when things are unstable and we can make change, we might not get another such moment. Same idea. This is a moment when, yes, it's scary and unstable, but it means we can instill positive change. And that is something worth really working for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is a great place to end.
Way better than the previous.
No, the previous made perfect sense too. But I think this is a very positive way to end, and encouraging for us to go out and fight the good fight. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and just thank everybody for coming here. And on behalf of National Council for History Education, as always, thank you to everybody for being here. And thank you, Joanne, for your time, your commitment, and your unbelievable grace and intellect. This is just a joy every week. So thank you for that.
Thank you, partner in crime. As always, I thank you all for coming. I thank you all for taking part in the kind of dialogue and discussion that is the basis of our democracy. And we should all be able to have this kind of public dialogue and to ask really serious questions and ponder answers, and not always have the answers in the way that we're doing here. So thank you for coming every Friday and being democratic with us. Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning. We will see you all next week, when I will magically come up with another topic. But in the meantime, for anyone who's new, we are now going to segue into the after party. And what that means is we will no longer be recording. But we will continue on with the conversation, a less formal conversation that can really go anywhere we want it to be. It's always a lot of fun. If you are on Facebook and you want to join the after party, you need to go and leave Facebook and then find the website and join through the link there, ncheteach.org/conversations. You don't have to belong to anything, you just have to click the link. Otherwise, for those of you who are leaving, see you next week. Bye to those who are leaving. Okay, and now